Mouthpiece. So we have a mouthpiece that the table is flat. It's symmetrical in the reels. You want this facing curve to be even, so when it opens, that things are working efficiently. So it's very important that we get the bottom of this reed to seal. So the number one thing we need in the system is, like, if a mechanic came in and said, you just said, hey, I need a whole new engine in my car. And he said, well, no, you don't. You have a vacuum line leak. That's why your engine is stuttering and stalling out, or you have a blown head gasket. It's not that your whole engine is blown. It's just the top end is leaking. So the first thing we need to do is make sure we have a great seal at all times on our mouthpiece. And this kind of goes into why I developed the ReedGeek and why some of the other methods sometimes worked or didn't work. The next part of the system is how the reed vibrates, opening and closing, and from left to right. So the three things, if we kind of sat down and said, okay, here's a class and we're going to do Reeds 101, there's three things you need to achieve on your reeds. And actually the quality of the cane is actually at the lower end, because we don't know really the quality of the cane until we get this reed proportioning and balanced properly. So we've all kind of heard about a balanced reed. I'm sure everyone says, oh, you need to balance your reed, or the reed isn't balanced, blah, blah, blah. Number one, balancing and flattening the table on our mouthpiece. Number two is, as we move closer to the camera, we have our heart, and then our reels is these wings, left to right, along this facing curve. They're opening and closing like this. If one is denser on one side, then it's doing this. Think of an airplane. If one side of the trim tabs was off, the plane's leaning, you're trying to get a balance. And so what we do as players is we try to change our embouchure, or we try to break down naturally one side till it starts to actually vibrate evenly. So when we hear about, oh, we need to adjust or balance our reed, the more we get this right and left kind of opening and closing, so the energy is going into our mouthpiece, very similar to going like a fuel injection system, going directly into the carburetor, into the cylinders of the car. So the more the reed is blowing open, then the air escapes out this way. So we're losing energy in our system. If our whole tube isn't vibrating at a certain frequency that it really wants to be in our system, then we start getting out of tune notes, and we start getting notes that are hard to play. So number one, again, flatness. Number two is our wing, the balance of our wing, opening and closing. Number three would be that heart. We all talk about the heart, and some reeds have different hearts, how thick the heart is, how thick the reed, and that's your opening and closing of the valve. So if we have a really open mouthpiece, this is a fairly open Oldberg Larson tenor piece that you can see, I'll try to get it in there, that we have a big opening here. If we have a real heavy reed with a heavy heart, then it's got a long way to vibrate up and down. And so historically, then what happens if we don't balance or get this to be flexible, then we start to bite to try to do it. And the more we bite, the more we shut down the vibration of the system, and everything again isn't working well. So there's always a give and take. We're humans. Some days we feel good, some days are bad. There's always a fluidity with the system. But what we're trying to do is to get the system well within like this 90 percentile, that these adjustments we make are become more subtle than trying to make all these, all these changes and movements in our jaw and tension in our hands and all that. Going back to why I developed these tools is that there was no great way to actually flatten your reed and to actually make precise adjustments to your reed. A lot of people would take the reed and they would put it on sandpaper and just kind of indiscriminately try to scrape, but you would actually be pressing down, and actually you weren't sure where the reed was actually out of balance. So it was kind of getting better, but then it wasn't getting better, and you were taking too much cane out of certain regions, so the reed was never getting flat. And the use of reed knives, which double reed players and seasoned single reed players that used to using knives, were basically straight razors. And it was all depending on how sharp you got it, how you knew about getting in certain regions. Often you would scrape too much. So the premise with the ReedGeek was to develop a tool, and everything is made in the US. These are some of the hardest alloys actually in the world, in the aerospace and defense industry. And so there's about 18 steps that go into making this little block completely perfect on every single edge. This particular one's the black diamond. This one's the classic. The main difference, and we'll just go over this very quickly, is the classic with the chromium actually has a couple different bevels here, but the edge will grab very directly. So it's going to remove the cane and flatten the reed very quickly. The G4 was our newer one with the diamond coating and everything. It's very, very smooth. And so it's a little bit more like shaving, like with shaving cream or so forth with a razor. It's going to just be a little bit more delicate on how it takes off the cane. It also has these bevels right in here. These were designed by myself, so you can accurately try to change, if I can get it in there, the spine contour. So the bevel actually takes the spine and actually makes a hybrid. So you can actually, instead of flattening the reed, you can actually make the spine a little more gradual. So you can adjust that up and down movement. The other thing on all the ReedGeeks are these little proprietary tips, and this curves are designed so you can treat it like a little pencil eraser. You can go around and just erase away the different densities that you want on your reed, or you can use it like a pointer and you can hit very small areas directly under where you want to hit. Every one of the edges is perfectly true, precise. You can actually touch the edge with your hand. You're not going to cut yourself. But the minute it sees cane or any other area, you can see it starts to take off whatever's not flat. So when the reed is warped and not seating well, it's like it's just blowing, it's stuffy. And you're like, oh, this doesn't work at all. So you end up taking that reed and throwing it aside or saying these reeds aren't good. So the first thing is that ability to flatten. With our products, at the stores in the UK and so forth, we do have, here's the G4. We do have it with this little kit called the G4 set. This is something we developed after. Basically, it's a little clear plaque, perfectly flat, that we can measure and find where our facing is. See if I can turn that around on our mouthpiece. And this is very akin to what mouthpiece makers, there's a little feeler gauge. This is about a thickness of a hair. And if you notice, this particular mouthpiece, I had worked on it or made sure it was flat, is sitting flat. And what this measurement is, 24 millimeters, is where that goes from flat to curved on your mouthpiece. That's your facing. And we can see that the gauge is perfectly flat. Often, you can put a reed on, and we could put a gauge on, and actually you can see how flat that reed was. So you can see this reed here. I actually touched a little bit with the ReedGeek, so it's starting to lock, but it's not quite flat. It's fairly close now that I actually went over with the ReedGeek, but often I could put gauges down people's reeds and it's slipping down. What we're going to do is I'm going to mark 24 millimeters on the plaque on this reed. So this is all in the instructions when you get the plaque and gauge. So it's kind of handy where you can visually see, but you don't need this to actually get the benefits of the ReedGeek, but it just kind of gets it a little bit more, more precise for you and a little bit more visual. Okay, and if we draw, I'm going to draw a sense of spine. I'll show you guys this here on this reed. So if we hold that up, drawing isn't perfect, but it's okay. But this was basically where the 48 millimeters. So on that mouthpiece, this is where the facing is. If we draw a sense of the spine, and usually when you get up to the light, you can actually see that spine contour, so you can almost trace it out fairly accurately. These would be your wings now, right? That's the wing that's vibrating along the facing curve. So if I put the gauge into the mouthpiece, where did I put my gauge? And drop it, you can see that it's not doing too bad. It's a little bit kind of wonky a little bit at the end, but it's basically kind of seating in. Just a little bit I did with the ReedGeek just in the demo actually brought this closer. But so the first thing we're going to do with the ReedGeek, so this is going to bring us back to why we do this. If you didn't have the gauge, the first thing you're going to do is pull your reed out and you're going to go over your ReedGeek. Any one of these edges, I kind of hold my hands like pointers. And basically I'm just sliding the ReedGeek off the top. I'm not breaking into the corner. It's starting to slide now. You probably can't see all the stuff that's coming up, but it's ultra smooth now. and sealed. You're actually sealing the pores also. Turn it around and we come back this way. And I can feel it grabbing. Like I actually feel it grabbing there, taking off anything that was out of square. And you could probably see these little shavings coming on. And when the ReedGeek just starts sliding, then it's flat. And it's feeling right now ultra smooth. And it's actually taking this reed and planed it perfectly flat. Putting it on the mouthpiece now, I can actually feel this. It's actually naturally adhering to the table. So it's actually sealing on its own, which is very important on the efficiency of our system. Putting my gauge down again. Yeah, so now if I put my gauge down here, it's locking in. I can actually feel it just kind of stopping there without a ligature. So this reed right now is in here pretty much flat. So now we know that we're starting with a flat reed. If we lick it and play it, you're going to continue with the ReedGeek if the fibers pull up. Before I go any further with, okay, what's our next movement on adjusting the balance of the reed? Number one, Reeds 101, the reed has to be flat. Okay, you have to start with a place of the reed being flat. And so in order to make these other adjustments for your response of the reed. After that, you can move the ligature. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but you can move the ligature up and down to kind of relax where that reed is going to be held, how open the reed is on that mouthpiece. But we're always starting with a place of flat and adjusting from there. Then you can make other adjustments, changing different ligatures will actually hold the reed at different kind of angles depending on how it tightens. It's just inevitably what happens. A lot of people ask me about treatment of reeds. So this reed is dry right now. I would probably put this in water, but if we lick it and we put it on the play, as it starts to take in moisture, it's going to start moving again because it's dry. So once again, I would, if I put it in water already, this just licking it that much, we've gotten some pulp to come up. And we're talking small amounts, quarter thickness of a hair, half a thickness of a hair. So one thing I do, I'm going to go over here, is I like my reeds in a moist state. This is a mason jar. I use a little bit of natural Listerine, sometimes a small amount of peroxide. I soak my reeds, I adjust them, and I keep them in a moist state. The natural Listerine, the yellow stuff, is great for killing bacteria and any mold, so I don't get mold. Sometimes I will leave them in the refrigerator in this system for up to a year. And I will pull out a reed and they actually play just like they did 6 months ago or a year ago. This is another little thing. It's called the Reed Well. It's a little glass jar that holds reeds in against the thing. I put this wood in. So basically when I pull a reed out, I'm always keeping it in a stable state. So this reed is fairly moist. I've already played this before. I've maybe done some adjustment. I've already flattened it, but I can go over with the ReedGeek right now. And I'm pouring a little bit of pulp on it, but it's actually very much flat. If I go ahead and put this a baritone reed and put on my baritone, it's going to start responding right away for me. And then I can kind of discuss which reeds tend to be a little more resilient to begin with, which ones broke down. But I want reeds in a constant state that's very consistent. So when I pull on my reeds, I want them to be consistent. I really don't want them to get wet and dry out, because what happens to when it dries, it starts to warp. So what will happen is you have to continue working with your ReedGeek. So if I start playing this reed on the tenor right now, in my play, well, maybe after 5-10 minutes, it's going to change a little bit. I would have to take it off, maybe ReedGeek a little bit, throw it more into water, pull it out of the water, ReedGeek again. So the flattening thing is something that you kind of continue with your ReedGeek. The more you keep your reed in a humidipack, you know, some of these other packs with the humidipack, keeping it stable, the less you're going to have to do heroics keeping your reed flat on the back. Once we marked where our facing is, and this is, if we use our gauge, we put that on the mouthpiece. This again comes with the kit. It's actually just a little bit extra actually for the kit, but it's kind of a cool thing. We can measure with the feeler gauge, find where we are in the mouthpiece, and everything is going to be different. Depending on what mouthpiece, tenor, alto, baritone, jazz, classical, clarinet, so forth. And then what we do is we can kind of mark like I did. We can kind of put the line right here or mark where you're facing, and then there's your spine. Anything on either side of that are your wings. So that's the flexibility of the wing. So I know this is kind of getting a little in-depth and technical, but if I was just a person like, I don't care anything about this, I just want my reeds to kind of work. This little tool, the reason why I developed it in something so simple is so someone doesn't have to be kind of a geek over this or so intellectually involved in it. Just taking the ReedGeek over the reed, the flatness isn't going to lie. This is, anytime we do this, it's going to seal the pores. It's even getting just more slick and more dense the flatter it is. I could take the sides of the ReedGeek or the curve and just go over each side of that area on the wings here. You can see, because all the reeds tend to, when they cut them, are going to be a little bit heavier on the rails. So you can just take this ReedGeek as a quick cut, or take your pencil eraser and kind of just feel with your hands a little bit where it seems to be, needs to be a little flexible, or just going over the spine on the Van Doren. There's plenty of wood there and spine in their reeds. So just this little quick adjustment I just did will probably make 90% of your reeds playable out of these boxes, provided that you have some sort of system to keep them hydrated. Again, in that, talking about this often takes a little bit longer. It's more in depth than actually just going in and doing it. And, we always go back to, do I have to really do all this? Can I just take the reed out of the box and play my instrument? And yes, you can, but you're going to always be kind of shooting, and things are always going to be inconsistent. And you're going to be spending a lot of time trying to get this system to work together. The selection of reeds is kind of like your personal selection. If I have a real open tenor mouthpiece, this is an old Berg Larsen, 130,000 to the pretty open, I generally know the brand and the style of reed that works well with this. Then from there, I make the adjustment. I'm not going to put a number 5 classical reed on this and then have to remove all this wood to get it going. So the industry, and if you're a clarinetist, there's the V12 that's a little thicker. There's the blue box Van Doren. You kind of find the reed that works well, and then you just go ahead and constantly make sure it's dialed in and fashioned to your mouthpiece system. And again, just for the sake of analogies, it's like, I'm a runner. I tend to like the Brooks shoes. You get those. If you have a custom insole that you like, then you customize that shoe. Every week, you don't buy a different brand. Every once in a while, you might try one, but you tend to zone into what works well for you, whether it's a standing shoe, walking shoe, what pants fit you. It's the same sort of thing. So you're kind of tailoring it, and then you have control over your system. So every time you go, you're not starting from scratch. You're not like, oh my God, I can't articulate my instrument.